Hi, I'm Perry Atkinson, General Manager here at theDove. Hey, check out our other videos and check out our website at theDove.us. Welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson. What a delight and an honor to have back in the studio with us today Dr. Dan Tomlinson. He's the author. He's a doctor, MD doctor, but he's lately been writing books, and they are fascinating. And today we want to talk to him about his book, On the Road to Emmaus, Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. There's a picture there on the screen, and we'll tell you how you can get one, but it is a fabulous book. I'm holding here one of his other books you wrote, Dr. Dan, and that is A Woman's Silent Testimony. And and then, of course, the book I wanted to touch on briefly is Birth Pains.
We don't have a copy of it. Birth Pains.
Let me just say this before we get into this. Dr. Dan's writing has taken him on an interesting journey into ministry.
Definitely.
And if you are needing someone to come speak at your church, or pastor, if you're going to take a little sabbatical or hiatus or a weekend off, you can trust your pulpit to Pastor Dan to come and speak to your congregation. And you're doing that a lot, right?
I do. This weekend, it seems like once a month, a pastor will be on vacation. I really feel like a little ministry, a little calling, and I've got PowerPoint talks that have content that the Holy Spirit shows up to.
That's wonderful.
So I'm enjoying the women's group. I'm teaching at Westminster. I'm going to Butte Falls. The Youth for Christ tournament coming up, and just a varied mix of evangelical and denominational churches.
Well, let me tell all of our viewers and listeners, whether you're listening and viewing up and down the coast, you're over in the Bend area, wherever you watch and see, he's a pilot too, so he can fly to where you are.
Like you, I'll come to you.
And he'll get there. Dan, before we get into The Road to Emmaus, I want to come back to a book that you wrote that really I was fascinated by, and Birth Pains.
Birth Pains. That's my baby.
That's your baby. And that comes out of your passion, your ministry, your calling as a doctor. But you liken the birth of a baby to the second coming.
Right. The book is one big fat allegory.
Yeah.
And it takes the premise that we're in the third trimester of a figurative pregnancy, the days of false labor, all the earthquakes that are happening, all the wars, the famines, the oceans raging, as Luke says. We're right in the days of birth pangs, of false labor. And just like false labor leads to real labor. Of course, the second coming of Christ is the birth, the most intense, dramatic thing that can happen to a woman, and then the other half of the population sees the most intense, dramatic thing, will be the most intense, dramatic thing in the history of the world, and that's the second coming. The time when blood's even up to the horse's mane, as it says in Revelation.
There you go. So, look at the world.
I know.
I mean, we got earthquakes. We had another one in Nepal. You got wars and rumors of war. I don't know of a continent that's hasn't got some kind of a conflict going on.
That's right.
You've got volcanoes down in Mexico going crazy and all over the place.
Tsunamis. You've got hurricanes rolling in.
Yeah.
You've got Israel coming back as a nation.
Right.
Jesus said it'd be like the days of Lot and like the days of Noah when there was a population explosion. There's never been a population explosion like we've had in the last 100 years. Daniel tells us that knowledge will increase and people will run to and fro.
Yeah.
Jerusalem would be a cup of trembling. On and on it goes. In the first coming, Jesus wept over the city because they knew not the time of their visitation. Right. Because remember, Daniel chapter 9 said there'd be 483 years from the rebuilding of Jerusalem till Messiah. We've got the same thing in play now. We've got all these signs. I don't know the day and the time. So that when you see people saying, "Oh, it's going to be on the Shemitah year," on September 11th or Y2K, that's not it. Yeah. But we can know the times and the seasons. Yeah. And Jesus said to be prepared, always be watching. So I think that we're the generation that it really could be.
All right. So it also says the beginning of the birth pains, and that's where we are.
Back to that pregnancy allegory, Perry. I don't have any of my pregnant patients from last year who are still pregnant. And they all deliver. And so this allegory is a true allegory.
Yeah.
We are a pregnant world, and we're going to deliver. I don't know when it's going to be. I think we're past the due date.
Well, wow. There you go. Another reason why you want to have Pastor Dan come, Dr. Dan come be Pastor Dan for a day at your church. All right, on the road to Emmaus. What inspired you to do this one?
Well, I had these 2 books, and I thought it was done. I said everything I wanted to say in the books. And then one of the pastors, one of the churches I go to, said, you're a good writer, Dan. You ought to write. And so I knew, types in the Bible have always inspired me. I'd been a Christian since the 70s, but I can remember the day like it was yesterday. In 1995, I was sitting in church, and the pastor said that the Old Testament is one big picture book, that we're children and we need comics, we need illustrations to show us what God's up to, and that Old Testament pictures of wars and birth pangs and labor and travail really picture something way bigger than just the actual concrete event, that God is an abstract being, and he has typed out the Old Testament. It's as commonly been said, the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed, the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. And so I just got excited about that. I go, okay, I'm going to write about that, because my left brain likes that sort of stuff.
I'm sure you experienced, like other authors, they get into a topic and all of a sudden it explodes on them.
It really did.
It did.
And it was fun to write, because I think the Holy Spirit, comes on you as you write, or as preachers will say as they preach, and they go, wow, I don't remember I knew that stuff. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I have to review my old stuff just because I don't remember it all, because it's a Jesus book. I love it.
All right, so let's take a look at this. You're basically saying, seeing Jesus in the Old Testament, all of the Old Testament books, there is a type,
everywhere.
A picture of Jesus.
Like he said after the resurrection, Luke 24, he talked to those 2 men on the road to Emmaus, saying that he says it talked from all the scriptures, from Moses and the prophets, the things concerning himself. So I divided the books into people that picture Christ, pictures that typify Christ, prophecies that proclaim Christ, and poems that sing of him.
Wow.
So there's 4 P's.
Where can they get the book?
Well, you can get it at Evangel on the internet. You can go to Amazon.com. The best site is my site, which is www.Dr. Dan's Books.
Okay.
Because we donate a portion of the money back to local charities, including theDove, Hearts with a Mission, Youth for Christ. People can just pick what they want the donation to go to.
Okay.
So, Dr. Dan's Books.
drdansbooks.com. Right. Let's come back. Interesting we would talk about this, because last night I was reading in Romans, and deals with the first Adam and the second Adam.
Yeah, Romans 5.
Yeah, and so I'm looking at that and I go, interesting, because I'm going to have Dr. Dan on tomorrow.
I'll bet you that Adam was the first type that Jesus, when they were on that road to Emmaus, I'll bet he talked about Adam first, because it says beginning in Moses, well, the first character, the major character is Adam, and he was a sinless champion. He walked with God in the cool of the day, just like Jesus did. And it says that in Romans that he was a figure of him to come, and then in Corinthians that Jesus is the last Adam, right? But then Timothy tells us that Adam wasn't deceived, that Eve was deceived, but Adam didn't. He actively chose to rebel, to eat the apple. Why did he do this, knowing that he was going to die? Well, what he did is what makes him like Jesus, because he died for his bride. She was enlightened, if you will. She'd eaten of the tree of the fruit of the good, knowledge of good and evil. Now she was living in the flesh, if you will. She wasn't dependent on God anymore. She was dependent on her 5 senses. And she was going to die, because living in the flesh brings death. So Adam, in a pathetic attempt to save his bride, instead of letting God work out a solution. And that's what makes him like Christ, because Christ did the same thing. He came and rescued us. He gave it all for his bride. Now, he did it according to God's will, unlike Adam. So there's a little anti-type there. Mm-hmm. But then you have the idea of Adam getting surgery on his side, and out comes the woman. Jesus getting surgery on his side, out comes blood and water, the fluids of birth, out comes our salvation. So there's a real picture there. And of course, Paul tells me I'm right, because he tells us that Adam's a picture of Christ.
Isn't that fascinating? Do you see Genesis as, it's the book of first, obviously, and a lot of things going on there, and maybe you can show me where you see Jesus there, including
types all over the place.
But do you see it as poetry, or do you see it as fact?
Oh, I see it as fact.
Okay, okay.
But it's one big picture of God's plan for the ages, and I see Jesus in the middle, super clear. So when I start talking about it on the outside, I know that there's people smarter than me that maybe see it a little differently on the creation story or how it went down, whether those were epochs or whether that was an actual day. I'm not prepared to say I know. There'll be stuff when we get to heaven, I'll go, oh, that wasn't quite how I understood it. But I see Jesus in the middle of the picture, super clear.
Okay. Explain that in Genesis. Where do you see him?
Well, Jesus is, Abel, the second character. There's Abel, a shepherd, who was killed by his brothers. He offered a blood sacrifice. Jesus became the blood sacrifice. The brothers envied him, just like Cain envied. In fact, Cain's a picture of salvation by works, because he worked up a gift where Abel gave the sacrifice. Benjamin, his name means son of my right arm. He was born as they were going to Bethlehem. Rachel travailed, and then as she died, because she probably bled to death, there was a lot of death and childbirth in the Old Testament, and she named him Benoni, son of my sorrows. Where Philippians says that he humbled himself and obedient to death, and then. But then Jacob says, no, he's Benjamin, son of my right arm. He's the one who was exalted. He's the picture of my completion, if you will. So he's both Benoni and son of my right arm, Benjamin. And of course, Isaac, one of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, Genesis 22, talking about that sacrifice where Abraham took him up to Mount Moriah, which is exactly Calvary. It's the same place. It's where the temple was built in Jerusalem. And then he offers the sacrifice, and Isaac says, Father, we have the wood and the fire, but where's the sacrifice? And he says, my son, God will provide himself a sacrifice. God's the sacrifice. He's not saying, hey, Isaac, I'm trying to shine you off. You're the sacrifice. No, God himself is the sacrifice. So Genesis is full of types.
Wow. All right, let me take a break here. Again, the book is entitled On the Road to Emmaus. You can go to drdansbooks.com and order it there, or if you're in the mall, go to Evangel. They have it there on the shelf along with some of his other books. A fascinating read, seeing Jesus throughout the entire Old Testament. When you get through with a study like that, you kind of sit back and you go, man, so much truth in one place, and so much evidence in one place.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll be right back with Dr. Dan Tomlinson. Okay, we're back with our good friend Dr. Dan Tomlinson, and he is an MD doctor, but he's also been writing books and doing a lot of speaking. And again, I want to remind you, if you want him to come and lecture in your church, or pastor, if you're going to take a weekend off, you can trust your pulpit to pastor. He's a temporary pastor. Well, he is a pastor at heart. Dr. Dan Tomlinson will come. Not
officially ordained.
And he's written several books. We're talking about The Road to Emmaus, seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. And there's a picture of it there on the screen. You can get that at Evangel or drdansbooks.com. Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. All right, you pretty much have got us through the Pentateuch, I guess.
Sure.
The first 5 books of the Bible. But he's there, obviously.
Sure.
You mentioned briefly patriarchs. Any more out there that typify?
Well, Joseph. The 11th son of Jacob. Joseph is a powerful, Genesis gives, I think, 13 chapters of Joseph. Remember, Joseph was envied by his brothers. Joseph and Jacob were living in Hebron, which means fellowship, and his brothers were tending the sheep in Shechem, which was a town outside the promised land, just like Israel was living outside of the promises of God. And then Jacob said, go and bring bread to my brethren, to your brethren, the bread of life, if you will, Jesus. But when they saw him afar off, it says they conspired to kill him, just like the Jews conspired to kill Jesus. They envied their brother, if you will, too. But then Reuben, the oldest brother, said, no, let's not kill him, throw him into a pit. Just like Pilate, Reuben's like a picture of Pilate. They were both inept. They wanted to save Joseph, they wanted to save Jesus, but they couldn't because they were powerless. So Joseph goes in the pit and he's sold off. Jesus goes into the pit, if you will. He dies, and he ascends into heaven for 2,000 years, where is now second in the Trinity, just like Joseph goes to Egypt and becomes second in all command. And then so there we are. We've got the story of you read the story. Joseph comes back and saves his brothers. Now we've got the second coming with Jesus coming back and saving the Jews. It's a total Jesus type.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah. All right, where do you see Jesus and Moses and David?
Well, Moses, those are my two favorites. Moses, of course, said there will be a prophet just like unto me in Deuteronomy. Him you should listen to. Moses, in his birth, was like Christ, because remember, he was set to be killed by Pharaoh, but rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, just like Herod was going to kill Jesus when he found out that the wise men had tricked him. Moses lifted the serpent in the wilderness. Jesus was the serpent in the wilderness. Moses parted the Red Sea. Jesus walked on the Galilean Sea. Moses married a Gentile bride. Jesus marries a Gentile bride. On and on it goes. Moses gives the first covenant. Jesus fulfills and brings the second coming in. So Moses is quite a type of Jesus. And then, of course, David is the king, if you will. And remember when he said he wanted to build to the prophet, I forget the prophet's name, but he said, I want to build you a house. And the prophet said, no, I'm going to build you a house. And you're going to have a posterity that your son will reign forever. And Jesus is, if you read Matthew chapter 1, he's the 28th son of Jesus. Now, of David, of the king. Every Jew knew their pedigree. And Jesus was the 28th generation, and 28 is a holy number, by the way, after David. Now, in 69 AD, all the records were destroyed when Jerusalem was razed. And so no future Messiah can come on the scene and say that I'm David's son, because the records aren't available. Jesus is the only one who has that pedigree. He was born in Bethlehem, just like Micah said would happen. And of course, the story of David and Goliath is the classic story in Samuel 17, where Goliath is the stripper, the 9-foot monster, whose name means stripper, is a picture of Satan. And he taunts the children of Israel just like that Satan taunts us, saying that we're spiritually unfit for battle, that we're losers, and we are losers. And David says, who's this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God? And he takes them on, he takes them down in an unexpected way with a shepherd's sling and then his own sword. Goliath's own sword cuts off his head. And then Jesus goes to the cross, unexpected, takes the sword of Satan, if you will, the cross, and turns it on him. How enraged Satan must have been 3 days later when he came out of the grave. And of course, because David took on the Goliath and prevailed, this says the armies of Israel conquered the Philistines, just like we can come on and the gates of hell can't prevail against us because of Jesus.
The book is entitled On the Road to Emmaus, Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. Let me encourage you to check it out at Evangel if you're in Southern Oregon, or you can go online to drdansbooks.com. And by the way, he's got other books, so you may want to check out Birth Pains as well. Definitely. All right, where is... Oh, this is fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
I'm glad you like it.
How do you see Jesus in prophecy? I mean, other than prophesying about him, do you see him in it?
Oh, he's all over the place. As I alluded to, Daniel chapter 9 said there'd be 483 years until Messiah came back. Well, on Palm Sunday, that was a fulfillment of that. Remember when he walked into his town of Nazareth and he quoted Isaiah 61. He sat down and read from the scriptures, and he said that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach to the poor, raise the dead, let's set the captives free. Right. And he says, and to bring the acceptable year of the Lord. The next verse says, and the day of vengeance of our God. And he didn't read that. He stopped. He says he closed the books, and he says, this day is this prophecy fulfilled in your hearing. Well, they didn't accept it, but he fulfilled that prophecy right there. Of course, Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, he was bruised for our iniquities. He was the chastisement of us all was upon him. By his stripes we're healed. That is such a fulfillment of first coming scriptures. And then Isaiah 7 to kind of complete the thought. Remember when he told Ahaz the king that, show me a sign. He said, I'll show you a sign. Speaking of that, they were going to take down the Syrians, but the sign will be that a virgin will bear a child, and you shall call him Emmanuel, God with you. And then Matthew tells us that was fulfilled when the angel appeared to Mary and said that, behold, you're with child, and this is a fulfillment of that Isaiah 7 scripture.
This has changed you, hasn't it?
totally got me on fire. Yeah, you know, as you go out and speak the word, as you know, because you're speaking the word all the time, you become what you spend your time thinking about and talking about. And I encourage people when I talk is to read daily and then speak it forth and do it. And so, yeah, getting to talk about this is such an upper, and it builds my faith.
Let me encourage you again, if you want Dr. Dan Tomlinson to come to your church and speak and talk about his books, or if you need him to, pastor, if you need somebody you can trust your pulpit with while you're on vacation or taking a week off, whatever, give Dr. Dan a call. How do they get a hold of you?
Well,
through the website?
Yeah, drdantomlinson.com.
Okay.
And then it will go right to a woman, Jennifer, that works with me, kind of marketing my ministry. And so drdantomlinson.com. Right. If you go to Dr. Dan's books, you can there's a link right to that.
Okay, Dr. Dan's book, probably, and then you get the books too.
Yeah.
Let me encourage you, check out Birth Pains while you're checking out The Road.
Yeah, that's my baby.
It's just, it's an amazing, you can't read that book and not read today's headlines and go, whoa.
I have people tell me that book explains the Bible. That they go, boy, I didn't get this stuff, and it kind of. Now it's 500 pages. The publisher said, you get, but it's everything I wanted to say, and it's 66 chapters, which I think is interesting because there's 66 books in the Bible. I didn't do that on purpose, but I thought that's cool. And they're short chapters, so you can read it like a devotional. I tell people to read it over about 3 or 4 months while they're reading other books, and they'll go at the end of the book like, wow, that was really fun.
Poems in the Old Testament.
Well, the book of Psalms, Psalm 22, the crucifixion psalm, you know, my God, why have you forsaken me? You know, I'm a worm. The bulls of Bashan have beset me. They said, come on down from the cross. You know, they pierced his hands and his feet. They cast lots for his clothes and for his, you know, and separated his vesture and so forth. And then, of course, Psalm 69, Psalm 45, and the Song of Solomon is, in fact, my book ends with the Song of Solomon. And I really spend a lot of time with that because it's this book that nobody gets. It's this book that is a story of love, if you will, agape love, but it's also a powerful allegory and a prophetic picture of the shepherd king married to his Gentile bride, if you will, or his bride made up of Jews and Gentiles, the church. And so if you see the Song of Solomon as a picture of Jesus and the church, people go, wow, that is really cool. And that book explains the Song of Solomon.
You know, Dr. Dan, so many people avoid the Old Testament because they think, well, A, it doesn't apply, B, it's just old history, C, it's hard to understand.
It's Jewish poetry and rules and regulations.
Rules and regulations, do's and don'ts. I'll just pick it up in Matthew and go forward from there. But what you've done here is you said, wait a minute, you can't totally appreciate the New Testament until you see Jesus in all 39 books of the Old Testament.
You know, the New Testament is written to us, or letters and books to us. But, you know, Paul told us that, you know, the Old Testament is examples for us, and he said not to be ignorant of biblical typology in Corinthians. And so that's a strong word. Don't be ignorant of something. That implies that we are being ignorant of it, that the Old Testament is all about Christ.
Well, folks, let me encourage you, check out his books, Dr. Dan's Books, that's DRDANS books.com. Right. And you can get the one that we're talking about today, The Road to Emmaus, Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament. And you can also check out Birth Pains there. And again, if you would like Dr. Dan to come to your group or your organization and speak, your church, go through that website to get to him. Pastors, I can say this, and I'll vouch for it. You can trust Dr. Dan with the pulpit for a Sunday if you want him to come and you're going to be out of town. Fascinating.
Thanks
Absolutely
a lot.
fascinating. I still think we ought to come back to Birth Pains down the road, you and I.
Have me back in a month or two. We'll talk about birth pains.
I'm looking at the headlines, and it's just disaster everywhere.
Yeah,
and I realize it's the beginning of birth pains, but I don't think the church is. It's kind of like the elephant in the room. We don't want to talk about that. Maybe Jesus could come in our lifetime.
I'd be surprised if he doesn't. If he doesn't come in our lifetime, when we die, we'll see him.
Yeah.
But I think we could hear the voice, the shout, and the trump of the archangel. And when hear the Lord say, "Come up hither," like we see in Revelation 4, and we'll be in the presence of the Lord, in front of the glassy sea, with God on the throne, the rainbow over his head. Revelation 4 and 5.
You're poetic. You're an inspiration.
It's going to be great.
Thank you, buddy.
You bet. Thank you.
Okay, we'll be right back.